So before I read my scripture, I have a couple of questions to ask. How many of you have ever read the book of Leviticus? Raise your hand. Whoa, that's more than I thought. How many of you have started to read the book of Leviticus and said, Some of the same hands. Okay. How many of you have never even thought about reading the book of Leviticus? Okay. Just to make you feel a little better, the scripture passage that I'm going to read today, now we've talked before about the lectionary, that it goes over a cycle of 3 years, and for each Sunday in that 3-year cycle there are 4 scripture readings. One from the Old Testament, one from the poetry, usually a psalm, one from the Gospels, and one from one of the letters. So those 4 passages, and the idea with a lectionary is that over the 3-year cycle you get all of the major themes of the Bible. Okay? With that as background, today's passage from the book of Leviticus appears only one time. There's only one time in the whole 3-year cycle that there's a reading from Leviticus. And it's on today, which is the 7th Sunday after Epiphany. Now, because Easter and Lent move, most years you don't have a 7th Sunday of Epiphany. So that one reading from Leviticus might only get read if you read the whole lectionary, might only get read every 10 years. So not only did you not find yourself particularly interested in reading Leviticus, the people who put the lectionary together didn't think it was worth all that much either. It is possible, even for someone who does this stuff for a living, to go without ever having read the book of Leviticus. All of that said, here's today's reading. It's from the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verses 1 to 2, and then 9 to 18. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all of the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, 'You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy.'" And skipping up to verse 9, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edge of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not defraud your neighbor. You shall not steal. You shall not keep for yourself the wages of a laborer until morning. You shall not revile the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. With justice you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people. You shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate in your heart anyone of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Leviticus is probably the best example of a characteristic that happens whenever you're dealing with an ancient text. Because when you take an ancient text and you have to try to apply it to a modern setting, whether it's the Bible or the Quran or even the Constitution, you're struck with an interesting problem. How do we take these parts that applied in a very different time and place and make them apply now? Or, the bigger question is, which parts apply now and which don't? And for those that do apply now, how do we translate them into a different cultural setting? The world changes, sometimes in radical ways. And literally, some pieces of an ancient text don't apply any longer. Now, you saw that we skipped verses 3 through 8 in the passage. And there was a reason the lectionary people did that. There's a little bit in there that we would read and say, oh yeah, that makes some sense. But there's a long section that we would have read and we would have all scratched our heads. Because the section that gets left out has to do with animal sacrifices and do's and don'ts with animal sacrifices. Now, we've never had one here in church. And imagine if next Sunday all of you brought in a sheep or a lamb, or for those of us who are a little less well off, maybe a couple of doves or chicken.
How about a gopher?
Shh. And we brought them in, and you plopped that sheep down on the communion table and got your knife out, and the animal welfare groups would be here before church was over. Wouldn't they? And even beyond that, if we didn't bring a live one in, so here's somebody who's feeling a little flush this week, a little blessed, and they bring in a side of beef. And the counters kind of look at it and go. And Nancy, she's filling out her QuickBooks spreadsheet, and she's thinking, where does that go? And how do I report that back to the deacons when they meet next month? So the lectionary leaves that part out. And it's pretty reasonable, isn't it? But we're still stuck with the question of how do we decide which parts apply and which parts don't? And how do we interpret those that do apply? I have shelves of commentaries on the Bible in my office. I have one crazy set called Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. It's about this long. It's 13 volumes. It has 70 pages defining the word salvation. 70 pages. It's a task. It's a task that we do. We struggle with what do these things mean? How do we understand them? And we do that with any ancient text. And again, that's why we have a Supreme Court of the United States. Their job is to say, okay, this is what the Constitution means when we apply it to this situation that has come before us. That's their whole job. That's their whole job, to figure that out. Now, Leviticus is particularly troublesome about these things. And like I said, it's kind of the poster child for an ancient text that you've got to struggle with. It is essentially a list of laws that were written for a theocracy millennia ago. You can't get more foreign than that. And if it was for a theocracy, these laws are more than just laws that were put together by some legislature. They are God's requirements for the nation. How in the world do we take that and apply it in our modern situation, where we certainly don't live in a theocracy, and if you're anything like me, you don't want to live in a theocracy. Because frankly, I don't trust anybody out there to tell me what God wants. I'm a good Baptist. That's my job to figure that out. That's your job to figure that out. Well, so how do we apply this book of Leviticus? And there have been lots of folk who've struggled with it over the centuries. And one of the answers that some folk give is they say, well, you have to separate it into moral laws, which apply, and cultic laws, those that have to do with religious practice, and they don't apply. Except Leviticus doesn't make any differentiation between the two. If we had read, there isn't a break after the part about not eating when you can and can't eat the animal that's been offered to God. It doesn't break and say, oh, that was cultic, now let's talk moral. It doesn't do that. They're the same. There isn't any differentiation. So that differentiation in and of itself is imposed on the text by the interpreter. Now, we all do that, and that's okay. We do impose our understandings. But you've got to be willing, when you do that, to say, and by the way, this is my interpretation of it. I'm imposing it. I'm reading it into the text when it's not really there. Now, most of the folk who say there are some that are moral and some that are cultic, they go even a little further, and most of the moral ones have to do with hot sins, and personal hot sins at that. The kinds of things that sex, who you can have sex with, when and under what circumstances, and property crimes done by individuals. That's pretty much where they put the moral stuff, and everything else falls under cultic things and doesn't any longer apply. It's much easier to take the person that's been caught in adultery and sit them on the sinner's bench, Jessica. I'm sorry, I apologize. The sinner's benches, when they had them, they were always the front pew, right, Cheryl?
Right.
It's easier to put the person caught in adultery in the sinner's bench than it is to struggle with questions of institutional and cultural racism. So it was just more simple to say, oh yeah, this is moral. And other stuff, we're not going to worry about that. It doesn't apply. Well, let me first say, in my 40 plus years of preaching, I've only preached on Leviticus one other time. And interestingly enough, it was 3 years ago. It came up in the lectionary. We had a 7th Sunday that year as well. Before that, never once. Never once. And while I'm sure I've read through the book of Leviticus more than one time, it's been a long time. Indeed, other than this passage, it's been a long time since I've even looked at that book. Well, today's passage, while it certainly isn't cultic, much of it falls under the category of stuff that gets ignored. Drive around our neighborhood anytime, drive out towards DP, and you will pass some wonderful, gorgeous avocado orchards, and right there on the fence is a sign that says, stealing avocados is a crime. And it doesn't matter if it's at the very edge of the orchard. You take one off and they see you, you're in trouble. Right? We live right next to the Santa Rita Hills, some of the most expensive grapes grown in the United States. Some of the Pinot grapes up there are among the most expensive grapes you can get for making wine. And every one of those every one of those vineyards is surrounded by serious fences. Serious fences. And I don't think any of those owners would be very happy to see someone helping themselves to those prized Pinot grapes because they were on the outside rows. Imagine the headlines in the news press tomorrow if a bunch of Central American refugees had been arrested picking grapes for themselves at Clopepe Vineyard. It would be front page. Now, if we read through the passage, which we did a few moments ago, there were certainly some of those things that we would hear and we say, yeah, that makes sense. We'll put that in the law. Yeah, you can't, you have to have justice. You don't give partiality to the rich or to the poor. That all makes sense. But this stuff about letting poor people pick the gleanings of your field, I don't think so. But as we read it, all of the rules point back to that second verse. Every single one of them. Follow these rules because God is holy. And if you follow these rules, you too will be holy. Being holy involves justice, but it also involves taking care of the poor. It also involves having extra responsibility for those who don't have, on the part of those who do. It involves building community that includes all, even the aliens. And that's true for the private kind of hot sins that are listed here, but it's also true for the larger societal ones. All contribute to what it means to be people who are holy. And each one of them gets punctuated by that wonderful statement, and why do you not make fun of the person who is blind? Because I am God. Why do you allow the alien to pick what's left in your field and never pick it clean? Because I am God. It's easy to see why Jesus quotes this passage. When he's asked, well, what's the law? And he said, well, you sum it up in two things. You love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all yourself. And then you love your neighbor as yourself. It's half of the law is summed up in this passage as Jesus quotes it. And at least the rules we read today, they fall pretty easily in a secular society as easily as they do in one that is an ancient theocracy. Okay, here's the disclaimer. You all know that my politics and my economics are pretty far, well, this way, to the left, yeah. Someone once said, I make Bernie Sanders look like Attila the Hun. That's not quite true. And, and I would argue, for me, at least part of that is a reflection of my understanding of my faith. But to say that my politics are to the left is not the same as saying that as a person of faith I have to be a Democrat or a Republican or a Green Party or any other political group, because clearly none of them deserve to be baptized. None of them are equal to what it means to be a follower of Jesus. None. And you can look at the policies and of any of those groups and you can say, yeah, I understand this, where this part might come from faith and this part certainly doesn't. And that's true across the board. We're not going to argue that. But that said, I am worried about our society. Because it feels more and more to me that we are embracing a society that is the opposite of what this passage calls us to be. That it is anything but holy. We see again and again proposals to dismantle the safety nets upon which many folk rely literally for survival. We see a system that just doesn't work for so many people. We read and hear justifications for pushing those who are already on the margins over the edge. And we see a system that rewards some while punishing others. I have to say that I was shocked during the Democratic debate these past days by one of the questions and one of the answers. It just floored me. you might have heard it, I don't know if you watched it, but one of the moderators asked Mayor Bloomberg, did you deserve your $64 billion? And his answer was, yes, I worked hard. Now, I'm betting some of you worked hard. I bet that some of you worked harder than he did. I've known single moms working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, trying to keep their kids fed and dressed and taken care of, and juggling more balls than I could ever juggle. And they're not even squeaking by. Did he work $63,900,957,000 more than they did? I don't think so. I don't think so. We hear the economy's doing great, and again, if you look at if you've got a 401k or something like that, they're doing pretty darn good. But at the same time, if you drive down the 101 and drive through LA, you can see there's a lot of folk for whom it is not going well at all. And today's passage says, that's not holy. That's not what we're supposed to be about. If we are to be holy as God is holy, and part of that reflects building a community where people are cared for and about, we are failing miserably. Now, that doesn't give us easy answers. There still is a lot of room to discuss what we do about refugees. There's a lot of room to discuss how the safety nets for the poor need to work and how we finance that and how we put it all together. There is still lots and lots of room to talk about how we build a society that is a civil society, but if we call ourselves Christians, we cannot avoid those questions. And they have to be framed in that way. It's not, do we help the refugee? It's, how do we help the refugee? It's not, do we care for the poor? It's, how do we care for the poor? It's not, do we build a civil society, or do we allow one to continue where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? That's not acceptable. And so we have to wrestle with those questions. And we cannot destroy programs that provide nutrition for poor children. Can't do it and call yourself a Christian. You can't cut funding for education. You can't cut health insurance. I heard on NPR they have on one evening a week they have a debate. Maybe you've listened to it. I forget even what this is. Sunday evening? They have a debate where they talk about a current issue, and they were talking about health care on the one. And there were some really, really wonderful, wonderful points. But one of the questions was, is health care a right? And one of the people answered, no. You have no right to health care. It is a commodity that you purchase, and if you ain't got no money, you don't get no health care. Well, that doesn't sound holy to me. You can't cut housing support for millions when housing is so incredibly expensive for people. You can't do any of these things without adequate replacements for them and call yourself Christian at the same time. You cannot turn your back on disabled folk and their families. You cannot turn your back on military folk who've served as we have asked and come back home broken in body or mind and turn your back on them. You cannot do that and call yourselves holy, call yourselves Christian. You cannot turn away from the elderly whose blood and sweat built our society. You cannot turn your back on the well-being of the citizens around the world when God calls us to be holy. We cannot ignore those who are yet to come. We can't even ignore the ecosystem that God created and called good. That is all part of what it means to be holy. And we are to be holy as God is holy. All of these things are punctuated. Why do you do this? Because I am God, and that's what I just told you to do. And part of being holy then means acting responsibly for others, even the alien. And so I think we begin by reframing the discussion a little bit. Why do we care for the refugee? Obviously, if we believe in separation of church and state, I don't stand up in a political meeting and say, we care for the refugee because God said to. Although as a person of faith, that's probably a good enough reason. But we care for the refugee because they are victims of horrendous violence. If a neighbor comes knocking on your door in the middle of the night and says, my house has been invaded and there's somebody there with a gun and they're trying to kill me, let me in. I don't know about you, but I open my door and let them in. It's the same thing. Compassion says we reach out to victims, especially to women and children. We reframe the question about caring for the elderly and we reinforce the safety nets because that's a way that we honor our parents and our grandparents. Those who built this society from which you and I benefit. We provide for the poor, and it never asks the question whether or not they're worthy. In Leviticus there, it doesn't say, oh, leave the gleanings of your field for the worthy poor. It doesn't say that. There's no judgment involved. Just leave it and let them come in. And why do you do that? Because I am God, and that makes you holy. So we provide for the poor because we have been blessed. And it is that picture there. It's the people who have the fields who are supposed to take care of the people who don't. We've been blessed. So we share. When any suffer deprivation, we all suffer from it. And I believe in my heart of hearts that there is more than enough for everyone. There are enough resources out there that everybody in our world could have enough to eat. Everybody could have access to education and healthcare and housing and nutrition and opportunity. But we've decided that we're not going to structure the system in a way that provides that. Leviticus tells us in this passage, this part that I think does apply. And I think we've got to struggle with how to apply it and how to make it fit in our modern society. Obviously, I'm not going to go to Club Pepe and knock on their door and say, actually I couldn't because the owner now lives in Napa. Knock on their door and say, you know what, you're not supposed to pick all your grapes and leave the edges open there for the poor people to come. That's not going to work. And yeah, it's not going to work, if for no other reason, because the poor people can't get there. How are they supposed to get to Club Pepe? But we do have to care. We do have to figure out how to make these things work if we are to be a holy people. We build a blessed community because we are blessed. We build a community that works for everyone because God is holy and we are called to be holy. And that is what holiness looks like. Building a community of caring and justice and equality. Why do we do it? Because God told us to. Because that is the right thing to do. That is what it means to be God's people.